I think Anil's forgotten to put us. Emily, good evening and welcome to another webinar from the Foreign Correspondents Club of South Asia. Today is the 27th May and we are still in a lockdown in New Delhi, but we are trying to make sure that we keep up with all the information and things that are happening in the lives of us journalists covering South Asia, India and South Asia here. So we have a very interesting webinar today, and I'm happy to be joined here today by my colleagues from the Foreign Correspondents Club, Emily Schmall, who's going to moderate this. She's from the New York Times, and Elizabeth Puranam. She's from Al Jazeera, and joined by a wonderful guest who's also a long-standing member of the Foreign Correspondents Club. So here we go with another edition of the Coffee with a Correspondent. Over to you, Emily. You have to unmute yourself, Emily.
Thank you, Manish. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Foreign Correspondents Club of South Asia and our ongoing series, Coffee with a Correspondent. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. If you're coming back, so good to have you here again. Thank you all for supporting our programming in this pandemic year. We are very fortunate to have as our guest tonight, Eva Oud Elferink, the South Asia correspondent for the Netherlands newspaper of record, Handelsblad NRC. In her 3.5 years in South Asia, Eva has covered everything from the Indian elections to the Delhi riots to the Sri Lanka terror attacks. She's visited wine country in Mumbai, profiled Indian cricketer Virat Kohli and astronaut Rakesh Sharma. And since the pandemic reached the subcontinent more than a year ago, Eva has been tirelessly hitting the streets to write about the horror, but also the humanity on display here. In April, she traveled to Nepal, which is where we'll start our conversation. First, though, I'll ask my fellow FCC committee member, Elizabeth, to please explain the format of tonight's event.
Thank you very much, Emily, and hello, everyone. So Coffee with a Correspondent was launched in 2020, last year, before the pandemic began, and it was envisioned as an opportunity for Delhi's foreign correspondents to talk about the technical aspects of their work, how they got the shot, the footage or the story, as well as how the work has personally affected them. We invite questions and comments throughout the hour. You can post them on Facebook, on YouTube, Twitter, or on the FCC South Asia site. We will receive them here. And feel free to pose as many of them as you can, and we will do the same. We will put them to Eva. Emily?
Thanks, Elizabeth. Now, Eva, back to Nepal. When you went recently, cases were rising very fast in Delhi. What compelled you to go to Nepal?
Well, it was actually a trip that I had already planned. I was already thinking about going to Nepal for, I think, a good month or two. And at that time, at least in Delhi, the cases were not yet going up as they were the moment I left. And also in Nepal, so the situation in Nepal was kind of similar, that the cases had seemed to plateau. It wasn't that bad of a situation. It was opening up. There was a lot of talk about the climbing season that would happen. And I hadn't been to Nepal in a good 2 years. And because I covered the whole region, I really wanted to go back to one of the other countries that I'm supposed to cover, that I've been covering from afar. So I'd been planning my trip for quite some time. And then quite early, or like at the latest moment before I was moving, like things were changing, or the situation in Delhi was changing, the situation in Nepal was changing very drastically. And in conversations with my work or my paper at home, ended up deciding that I wanted to take the opportunity to go to Nepal to see what was happening there, because it seemed that it was going to be very likely that the airspace might close very soon, that the borders might close very soon, and I wouldn't be able to report from Nepal as I was hoping to do. So yeah, I left when it was getting very bad in Delhi. So that was a difficult decision, and it was also a decision that, to be honest, I kind of struggled with while I was there, and also made me decide to come back early. But we'll get to that.
Okay.
Later.
Yeah. So tell us about the healthcare system that you saw there, and kind of what was the state of patients and doctors. Was there a lot of anxiety? Was there a lot of fear? And for those of us who haven't been to Nepal, could you kind of just summarize the healthcare system that the country has?
So the healthcare system in Nepal is extremely limited. Nepal is a very poor country, so it has, beyond the big cities as Kathmandu, the healthcare system is very basic, non-existent. People have to travel usually pretty far to be able to get the proper care, to find a doctor, to find the right equipment that doctors need to give the proper treatment, especially for the people that live more higher up in the mountain areas. And so I was actually mostly, in the brief time that I was there, I was mostly up in the mountain region where people would have to literally carry their loved ones if they are very sick to the next village where hopefully there is a clinic, or either carry them as far as places where there are helicopter platforms to take people down to either Kathmandu or to other places where they could get the treatment that they would need. So when I was in Kathmandu, in the end, I was there for a day and a half that I was in Kathmandu itself. And at that time, the cases had already gone up quite drastically. So when I arrived in Kathmandu, I think it had gone up from 500 cases a day to 1,000 cases a day. The next day would be 1,500 cases a day, then 2,000 cases. So it was the same trajectory that we actually had seen happening in India, have seen happening in Delhi as well. So it was already pretty clear that it was going in the wrong direction, especially in the border areas with India. There already the situation from the doctors that we heard of was getting completely out of hand, that the hospitals were overflowing. And the one particular hospital where I interviewed a doctor, an infectious disease specialist in Kathmandu, is HAMS Hospital, which is one of the best private hospitals in Kathmandu. And at that time, the government had only just announced that there was going to be a lockdown, but their ICU was already full. The doctor was saying that he was very worried about the situation going forward, about the oxygen supply for their hospital. Again, it was one of the best hospitals in Kathmandu, and they were already facing issues. And that was late April. Well, I think we've all by now seen, or I think most of you must have seen the situation as it is right now in Nepal, that all the hospitals pretty much have been struggling a lot with not only oxygen supply, but just the sheer number of patients needing help and needing to be admitted and not being able to admit them. So, for instance, in Kathmandu, again, hospitals were saying, or the doctor, I called him up when I was back in Delhi to ask how the situation was since we spoke last time. And he said that they had to release keep beds empty because it just did not have this oxygen that they would need to have patients in these beds to be able to give them the care that they needed. So it was a pretty dire situation, and it still is. I think the latest reports that I read is that the oxygen supply is getting a little bit better, or the crunch of oxygen is getting a little bit better, but it's a pretty terrible situation that we've.
Yeah. And what was the mood like? Was it grim like it was here?
So I was there very much at the changing point. Mm-hmm. So where you could see that people were already getting anxious, and people were very anxious about all the reports that were coming in from India. And they saw that the numbers in Nepal were going up as well. But it still was just before it got to that very bad point. So I was there on the verge that the lockdown was going to be implemented and that people had to stay in. And when I was there on the last day before the lockdown went, you could still see people were out and about in the streets, were out going to cafes that were open for the last time. So there was a worry, but it was mostly talking about India and pointing to India, and also kind of saying that the fact that now the cases are going up in Nepal is because of all the tourists coming in from India and all the Gulf workers, Gulf migrants that were using Nepal as kind of a transit way because so many Gulf countries had already closed their airways to India. So there was this influx of migrant workers that were using Kathmandu as kind of like their stepping point to stay there and then be able to travel to Bahrain and Oman and all these other places, Kuwait, that had closed the airspace.
Interesting. So you mentioned that most of your reporting in Nepal was up in the mountains, and you took the famously terrifying flight to Lukla, and then you were trekking. So can you tell us a bit about that journey and what the reporting was that drew you up to the sort of the heights of the mountains?
Yeah, so coming back to my original plan when I was planning to do stories from Nepal, one of the stories I wanted to do is about Nepal's mountain economy, and especially about the Sherpa community who depends so much on the mountain economy. So Nepal is, as I said, a poor country, developing country, and it is very much partly relying on tourism. And last year, Nepal had implemented a lockdown very early. I think at that point there were just a few cases, maybe 2 or 3 cases, but implemented the lockdown just when the climbing season, which is the peak season for tourism, was supposed to start. So there was no tourists coming in for trekking, no tourists coming in for mountaineering. And this is the time when Nepal and all these people that are dependent on the tourism economy would have made millions and millions of dollars. So I wanted to go back and to see this particular area going up towards Everest. I didn't go up to Everest myself. That was a way too long of a trek. But to go to the area where all the trekkers and the climbers would have to go through when they're going on their way to base camp, when they're going up to Mount Everest, to speak to the people that work there, have their hotels there, have their guiding companies there, and of course, like the Sherpa community that is so detrimental to all the climbers that want to make it to these big summits. So that was the plan, and at first the focus was in my head was going to be more the economy and how they were able to sustain themselves in a year where their only income had vanished. But yeah, because the situation had changed so drastically in a short amount of time before I went up there, it became way more about the risks that they take. Like it's a very risky job, especially for the ones the Sherpa community that go up to the mountains. And the risky situation that they've been put into by the government deciding to open it up, even though already by that time it was pretty clear that the situation could get out of hand in a very dangerous place so high up. So it turned into more of a health risk kind of situation. So yeah, I took the flight to Lukla, which I'd heard a lot about, and it was just as scary as I'd been told. But yeah, we made it there, and so for me it was the first time going up to this area. So I hadn't been to Lukla, and when I was there, I was accompanied by a journalist from Kathmandu, Shristi Kapla. So I reported together with her. And we had Sonam, who is fantastic. He's a trekking guide. He was a mountaineering guide, but then after a few years, he developed problems with his sinuses, which is one of the many things. Well, we might get to that about the risks that come with the jobs that they do. So for the past 2-3 years, if I say correctly, he's been a trekking guide instead of a climbing guide. So he was the one who was going to take us up to the areas that we were planning to go. And he is from Lukla. And so I didn't have a reference point, but from what I understand from him and from Shristi, who's been there quite often, is that usually Lukla is this tiny little town, but with all these climbing gear shops on the side, of course, hotels and bars, because it's the first stop for people who come from Kathmandu and then fly to Lukla. And it was pretty deserted. It was there were not that many people. There were, of course, a few tourists, climbing tourists and trekking tourists, but I was told that usually, like, the streets would be swamped with people.
That's interesting because we know that Nepal issued more climbing permits for Everest this year than ever before, but it seemed like the trekking scene was diminished.
So that's the thing, because for the climbings, for the actual summiteers, these are people that have trained for a long time, have paid a lot of money, and are you could say like a lot more set on the idea, like whatever happens, I'm still going. Like as long as I'm allowed to go, I will go. As for the trekking tourists, it's a bit more complicated because until, and I have to say this correctly, but I think it was late March, there was the recommendation or the obligation for tourists, for anyone coming from outside of Nepal, to stay into a 10-day mandatory quarantine. Right. Which for people who are just going there for a trek of 10 days or a week or maybe even a few days, that makes it very complicated. and not so interesting as a more of a holiday kind of activity. And beyond that, there's also just a lot of countries that have still a lot of travel restrictions. So I know, for instance, from the Netherlands, like the entire world practically was out of limits. So if you would go to a place like Nepal and you would get injured, you would not be insured. So I think that kept a lot of the usual trekking tourists away, and it was the more hardcore climbers for sure that were there, and still trekking tourists. But so the route that I was taking, you have several stops where you need to register as a foreigner. And they would say, like, today you're number 50 that registered, where usually they would have 300, 400 people registering in a day. So it was a very different scene.
So, I mean, you have these extremes, right, where you have this economy that is so dependent on tourism and that missed out on the entire season, essentially last year when Nepal went into lockdown. And at the same time, you have this public health crisis where people know that if they get sick at those altitudes, there aren't a lot of options for them. So how are people feeling? I mean, how did they weigh the balance? Were people happy to take the risk of engaging with more tourists, of participating in that tourism economy, even if it meant potentially falling sick? Or did you feel that people actually were prepared to kind of dig in for another year, missing out on tourism revenues in order to kind of not take that risk?
Well, that's the thing. It's the ones that could afford to sit it out. So I've spoken to a few people from within that were owners of hotels, for instance, or even Sherpa climbers that would go up to do expeditions usually, who decided that no, that for them the risk was too high this year and they didn't want to take it. So they didn't open up their hotels for tourists, and they didn't go up for an expedition this year. But for many others, that is just not an option. It was not an option to, again, stick it out. Many were able to stick out last year to like not have that income in 2020 because they had some savings left, and they were able to make it through with that. But for another year, like, this is the only window that these few months, these 3 months, for most of them, are the only months in which they make an income for the rest of the year. And it's not just them that depend on that money. It's like an entire family. It's often the wife, it's often the children, it's sometimes also the parents that are dependent on that. So the people that I spoke to were very worried, especially because I was speaking to the women that were, the women that were left behind were waiting at home, knowing that their husbands were up in base camp or higher up already at that time. And getting the news that at one point, the first cases at base camp had been found, and like the government is still trying to downplay that. But it already at that time, it was clear that there were the first few cases at base camp, and they were extremely worried. But they said that we have no option. We've spent all our saving monies. We have our children that have to go to school. We have to pay the school fees, so they have to go up.
Right. Elizabeth?
Yeah, Ava, I wanted to ask you, but I think you just answered my question. I wanted to ask you if it was compulsory for people who wanted to go to base camp or even further to provide COVID negative certificates, given that the health of people they're going to come into contact with, that these people live in very remote areas, and as you're talking about, don't have great access to healthcare. But it doesn't sound like that was something that was necessary to go that far.
So the obligation was there to have a negative PCR test for the people that were coming in from other countries. So you need to show a negative PCR test on arrival, and then they were supposed to stay into a hotel quarantine for at least 24 hours, and then do another test, show a negative test, and then they were allowed to move upwards towards Lukla and base camp. But there was very little checking happening. There was actually no checking beyond the checking that happened at the airport. So there is talk, and it's hard to say in how far it's true. Like, I spoke to some mountaineering companies and some climbers who came in from the US, who came in from Canada, who said that they followed those rules. Like they did all the tests and they had their quarantine, but then they traveled through, like they traveled forward or onwards. And in the travel onwards, there are all these moments where you can still get infected. And there were only a few of the mountaineering companies, from what I understand, who had camps at base camp, who had their own testing facilities with them. So who had, and these are the rapid antigen tests, so not the PCR tests, but who had tests with them so they could test the people in their own group. But that didn't go for the whole population at base camp. So there were a limited amount of tests at the base camp itself. So for that was also one of the reasons why, when the first cases start going up, like, it's very hard still now to get any details or any information, credible information about how widespread it is. Because if you would speak to the Himalayan Rescue Association, who are running a private clinic, or not a private clinic, but a government clinic actually at base camp, who would be one of the first point of contact for the people that are getting sick at base camp, they don't have tests. So when I reached out to them, and Shruti reached out to them, they said, like, we cannot give any information because we don't have tests. And they also, of course, were under, they wouldn't say, but it was clear that they were under quite a lot of pressure from the authorities to not share any information at that point about an outbreak that was clearly happening.
And so that sounds like, at least some of the same issues that we've seen here with a lack of testing. And Nepal's surge has been compared to the surge in India, not in terms of the actual number of cases, but in proportion to their population. And given all of that, Ava, we have a question here that's been sent in. Has there been criticism in Nepal, similar criticism as there was in India, regarding the government not preparing well enough for a second wave?
Absolutely. So in more than just one way has the second wave hit Nepal as it hit India. So there's been a lot of critique on the government that was just very focused on the political crisis or the political infighting that's been happening there for a few months now, where the prime minister has been trying to hold on to power, has dissolved parliament, but the parliament was reinstated. Now it's dissolved again. And there was this whole power tussle within the Communist Party, which meant that during the months that the numbers had gone down, there were these massive rallies that were happening in Kathmandu, where the different camps were trying to show force. And that was just one of the many ways in which there was the redress that was there in the beginning of the pandemic with the lockdown, of course, and also afterward, people were trying to still be careful. Nothing of that was there, not from the government side, who was just very busy with their own political crisis. And there had been hardly any, or actually almost no preparation for that second wave, of which doctors were saying, just as in India from the very beginning, we need to prepare because the second wave will be there. Especially in the months from January onwards, where there was clear signs from India that not only was there a second wave, but new variants were also going around, where doctors said, it's just a matter of time before that's going to happen here. And we need to prevent making the same mistakes as we did in the first wave, which was that there was very little testing that happened. There was very little, actually hardly any contact tracing that was happening. Isolation was also hardly happening. There were some isolation facilities that had been put up in the border areas, which were, I hadn't been, but I've heard pretty horrible stories about it, where doctors were saying that people were getting sick, getting diarrhea from staying there because the conditions were just so terrible. So in the months, again, as happened in India, in the months that the numbers had gone down, where there was this breathing period where the government could have prepared better isolation facilities, could have prepared for sure additional hospitals, additional hospital beds, increase the oxygen supply, increase oxygen plants. None of that had happened. And also when the numbers were going up, were clearly going up, and it was unmistakable that the second wave was there, the government was still reluctant in admitting so. So the climbing permits are a very big example of that. The climbing permits were granted even throughout when I was there. So there were new permits that were added to it. So there was this denial for the longest time that it was actually going in a bad direction. And when the government admitted to the fact that it was actually needing, that it was going to that the cases were going up so drastically that a lockdown was needed, I think it was 2 or 3 days after that, the Ministry of Health came out with a declaration which was summed up by the Kathmandu Post as "we give up" on their front page, which kind of said it all, because the government or the ministry was saying like the cases have gone up to such a point that already we cannot cope, and they were calling on people, on the Nepali people, to be careful. And so, yeah, there's a lot of anger amongst Nepalis that the government was just so busy. And there was already this anger about this whole political crisis that had been happening, that still today is taking, well, not, I wouldn't say preference, but I'm not finding the word, but that is one of the main things that the government seems to be busy with, even though there is a very, very massive health crisis going on in the country.
Right, yeah. Just for those who haven't been paying attention as closely, Nepal is in the middle of a political crisis as well. The government was recently dissolved, and the prime minister called for fresh elections. It's not clear if that will take place, but all of this is the extremely chaotic backdrop of this public health crisis. Manish, I think you had a question?
Yeah, it's very interesting, Eva, that you were there at the time that Nepal has plunged itself into a political crisis and twice dissolved. Once the Supreme Court has already said that they will not allow the parliament to be dissolved. What is your handle on the political situation? I'm segueing a little bit away from COVID, but what is your handle of the political situation? Where do you see it going? And my second question is that, is Nepal blaming India more for the surge in COVID crisis, or China, or both? What's the general outlook there?
Well, the take on the government or on the political crisis, I have to be honest, is difficult to say right now, because there is a lot of backlash. The opposition has been rallying already from the beginning about the undemocratic ways, as they're saying, that the current prime minister is handling the situation, is clinging to power, has now decided together with the president but with the backing of the president, that fresh elections should be run in November, and in the meantime he will keep running the government. So it's hard to say which way it will go, if the Supreme Court will intervene. There is a lot of pushback, but he's been able to hold on so far. So we'll have to see how that takes it forward. When it comes to the blame, I haven't publicly heard anyone from the government pointing fingers at India or Nepal in that sense. Might have missed that, but from the public side, definitely. So as I said, when I was going through, both in the Everest area, in the Kuntu area, and in Kathmandu, pretty much every person I was speaking to would reference to India, would reference to how the situation had moved from there to here, and they couldn't really see any other way of how the infections would have spread otherwise as much as they did. So there is a lot of anger as well on that. There's a lot of finger pointing. Yes.
Ava, I have something. I wanted to ask you something in relation to that, and that is, we know that Nepal, along with India's other neighboring countries such as Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, have been affected very badly by the stopping of exports, of vaccine exports. So I'm not sure if you were hearing anything about that at the time that you were there. How
definitely Sorry, no, definitely, because Nepal had to stop its vaccination program pretty soon after it started, and it had already started pretty rocky. So the plan for Nepal was to start off same as happened in India, first with the frontline workers, with the healthcare workers, and the 65 plus population. But it very soon got into trouble because there was at that time, same as in India, again, a lot of hesitancy, because there had been a lot of mixed messaging also from the government side, but especially also in the news about the vaccine that would be administered, which is the Covishield AstraZeneca vaccine. So there was a lot of hesitancy that the government didn't quell, and it didn't quell enough. So the uptake in the beginning was not that much. And then came, of course, the export ban that made or forced Nepal to first stop its vaccination program. And it only was able to restart again when there came help from this other country in the region that is trying to gain influence together with India, and that's China. So China had sent just before, not that long before I arrived, had sent 800,000 doses of the Sinopharm vaccine. And so Nepal had restarted their vaccination program, but that meant that a lot of people that were supposed to get or had their first shot of the Covishield vaccine could not get their second shot because there's just not any doses of that left. And there was also a lot of confusion with the Sinopharm vaccine, that it should only be administered to people up to 60 because there had been other side effects that had been found for people over that age. So they decided that they were not going to give that vaccine to people over 60 years old. So you had this gap of people that were 60 to 65 or 61 to 65, 64, that all of a sudden fell between the cracks, which is an older population, which is deemed vulnerable and was supposed to get vaccines. So there was also a lot of frustration also from doctors because they saw that the vaccines were also the very limited amount of vaccines that were there were being given also to diplomatic missions and to journalists, and it was because there was a lot of confusion about how that was supposed to be administered. I was there to visit one of the vaccination sites that was happening in Kathmandu the day before the lockdown started. With the Sinopharm vaccine, and there were massive lines outside. I don't recall the exact number, but there were hundreds of people that lined up that day to get their vaccine. And to give you an idea, already at that time, the lockdown had been announced. The numbers in Kathmandu were going up drastically, and I was in a hospital where people were standing back to back in this massive line in a hospital that was very poorly ventilated, I can say, to get their shot. So they were there very happy to be able to get a vaccine, but beyond wearing masks, there was nobody that was maintaining social distancing. Also, people from the hospital were not making sure that people were maintaining social distancing. So it was a very kind of surreal situation to see. And the bad news is as well that even though at first the doctors were hoping that throughout lockdown the vaccination would continue, so there was at least that bit of protection that would continue, the vaccination program was stopped because of the lockdown and the government not wanting people to go out and venture and get these kind of massive of our people mending together. So the vaccination has stopped as well.
So now we have a situation in Nepal where there are 500,000 cases, which of course, compared to a larger country, maybe doesn't seem that many, but we know proportionally, as Elizabeth said, it's a huge number and far exceeds what the Nepal health system can provide. So I'm curious about, you had told me earlier that when you went to Nepal and Delhi was just sort of falling into this crisis, the surge was happening, it was difficult psychologically sort of to be there while this crisis was underway here. And now we're in a situation where Delhi is somewhat stable, the situation is growing worse in Nepal. And how do you, I'm just curious, as a journalist, how do you reconcile those things? When you were in Nepal, how did you manage not to become totally absorbed with what was happening in Delhi?
Well, that was very difficult. I would wake up, and the first thing I would do was check my phone, check Twitter. And at that time, I'm sure for everyone that is in India right now, is in Delhi right now, Twitter was horrible because it was just one big cry for help. It was a cry for help from people. It was a cry for help from even the hospitals. It was just sheer horrible pain and suffering and just that. It was, every new post was that. And even in my WhatsApp group. So every time I would open my phone and see that, it was very difficult to kind of, realize that I wasn't there to be able to cover, especially because Delhi is also, it's not just my part of my patch to say, it's my home. It's my friends, my colleagues and everyone that is living there and is living through this as well. And so I find it very difficult. I talked about it quite a bit. I was lucky to have Shristi with me, so I kind of could talk to her about it. And it helped when I was with her to kind of just change to the fact that I was in Nepal and I had the story I was there for work as well, a story to follow. But it was difficult. Yeah, it definitely was difficult. And that's, again, why I decided while we were there that I was not going to stay as long as was planned, but it was going to come back early. and other way around, like being here in Delhi, you get very much absorbed, living everything that's been happening here. But I've been trying to follow as much as I can from what's happening in Nepal, and it's heartbreaking because you could tell that was going to happen. Like everyone was saying it's going to happen, and to see it then play out, it's frustrating. Like you can see I can get the frustration and the anger of people.
Right. Yeah, Elizabeth, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I was really interested to hear you talking about how, I guess, torn you were as well. And on the same lines along what you're saying, like what was your calculation in deciding that you would stay in Nepal, but that you were going to cut short your trip, as a journalist?
Well, when I decided I was going to cut short my trip, I was up in Namche, which meant that I couldn't leave very much on a whim. Like it could take, it was going to be a bit expensive to get a helicopter out. But it meant just literally that I had to fly back, and then had to do tests, because before I could fly back to India, I need to get a test done. And already at that time, the government had decided that for travel, they restricted the places where you could get a PCR test done. So it was a bit of a hassle. So it was also just a calculation that I needed a few extra days before I was even able to fly back to Delhi. And I tried to make use of that time as much as possible to still at least venture out in Kathmandu and speak to doctors there, visit hospitals there, get my own test done, which was, again, same situation as when I was seeing the vaccination happening. I was at HEMS Hospital, which was, as I said, one of the better hospitals, which was assigned to be one of the places where you should go to get a PCR test done, one of the few places. And it was swamped with people. There were, I'm pretty sure, about 200 people when I was there. And they were trying to call out to people, you have to maintain social distance, and because we're in a critical situation. This is not a normal situation, and there was no place really to space out. So there were people everywhere, and everyone was kind of pushing because they wanted to get their test done and they wanted to go and go again. So it was a strange realization, but again, it kind of gave me a bit of calm to know that I was going to come back to Delhi. At least soonish, not maybe as soon as I'd hoped, but soonish. And it also gave me some rest that I could still do some reporting in Nepal, as I said, because it was clear that it was going completely in the wrong direction. So to get some more input from the people there before I would be back to Delhi.
Yeah, Manish, please.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Elizabeth.
No, all I was going to say was that it's extraordinary that you were there, because as Emily has been saying, you're one of few foreign journalists who were there at that time. And even if you did make the decision to leave early because of where you were, it doesn't mean that you could get on a flight the next day.
Yeah, I was in contact with Vanessa, who's a French journalist, also from Delhi, who had been or was in Nepal at the same time, was supposed to stay there longer, and we were texting to each other what are you going to do? Are you planning to stay? Are you planning to leave? At that time, she was thinking about staying, but also because pretty soon afterwards, it became clear that Nepal was going to cut all stop all the international flights. She also decided to come back.
Let me ask you, Eva, you were there for at least a couple of weeks, right? You were there for
No, I was there in the end only for a week.
Only for a week. But
Yes.
what you see, India decided after 16 years, the situation became so bad in the second wave that India decided in the second wave to actually ask for foreign help. Did the Nepalese government decide? Did you hear anything about asking for foreign aid? And there is a lot of foreign aid organizations which have a good sizable presence in Nepal, like USAID, there's UK, there's GIZ, there is many countries. Did you hear anything about them coming to the rescue?
Yes, very much so. We've seen the images, especially of China. But Nepal has been dependent other than India, has been a lot more dependent on foreign aid all this time already before this pandemic. So yes, there were very early onwards, the Nepali government was reaching out to its international partners, other countries, asking them for help in getting vaccines when the vaccination program, of course, stopped. But also when it came to the oxygen problems, asking for oxygen cylinders, asking for medicines. I think somebody told me that there was, even when I was still there, so it meant that it was a situation in Delhi was a complete crisis, and also elsewhere, that there had been reaching out, like the Nepali government had reached out to India as well for help. So definitely there has been calls for help, and there's also help that has been granted. So for instance, from China, we've seen pictures of like truckloads full of oxygen cylinders, amongst others, that have been moved towards Nepal. And that's one of the things that I think also for the Indian government is it might be distressing to see and to realize that it's not only Nepal, but China has very much taken or has seen the situation, grabbed this situation to show that it can still play that role, that it can help when other nations in this region are in crisis, a role that India wanted to play and has been playing as well, and up until this pandemic. So when it came, for instance, to the vaccines, India was, of course, and this is now the critical point, in that India was exporting vaccines up until March to other countries. Of course, a lot of them were commercial deals that were struck with Serum. It wasn't the government giving these vaccines, but still the Indian government has also donated vaccines and has been helping out other countries from the beginning of this pandemic in the first wave, also when it came to rescue flights. So it has played that role, and it has now been forced to stop, and China has been able to take on that role. So it will be interesting to see how that will maybe change the situation further in terms of the gain of influence in these countries where they're both trying to get to gain more of a foothold.
Let me follow up with another question. Do you think that the situation is so bad in Nepal from the way you describe it? Naturally, you've just been there. Do you think this is, in some ways, if there is a democratic election, this will mean the end of the Oli government? What is your perception? What is your feeling?
I find that very difficult to say. Like, there's a lot of anger towards his government, but also still there's a lot of support for Oli as well. So I find it very hard to say. Same as when it comes to India, where people were saying, well, there is a lot of anger now going against the Modi government, and that might cost them in the next election. Well, it's pretty hard to say if that will actually be the case. Of course, Modi and the BJP are a lot stronger, and he's a lot more popular than Oli is. But it's hard to say. It also depending on how long it will take before elections will take place, if the anger against him will be enough to force him out of power.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask a question just about process. And you're among the foreign correspondents whom I've seen here in Delhi work most seamlessly across mediums, and this includes social media. And when the pandemic began last year, you began this daily diary on Instagram. You were posting pictures and footage and text on a daily basis. So I'm curious, how much of that exercise helped you sort of process what was happening and kind of synthesize information for the reporting that you were doing at that time?
Well, it was very much helping me to kind of mentally also deal with the situation that we were in, which was like the lockdown last year, especially. Like this year, it was horrible. Last year, it was just mostly a very distressing situation, because everyone, for the whole world, nobody really knew what was going on, what was happening, and there was this new virus, and we all had to stay in. And it was just to see all of a sudden Delhi, this city that is always so full of life and sounds and everything, to go completely quiet and see the streets completely empty. So it kind of helped me to keep track also throughout in the end, it was 2 months of that lockdown period, how the situation was kind of changing or not changing. And especially looking back, like it's this helpful tool now that I have to kind of look back and see how we were living through that situation, and day to day what the what the stories were at the time, where you could see the problems arising with after week one, or I think after week one. Well, before that already, I think pretty early onwards, of course, the migrant crisis that happened. But then slowly it was becoming very clear that a lot of people, the daily wage laborers and people living like hand to mouth, living from the money that they earn in a day, not having anything to eat, basically not having anything to eat, and how the problems that were arising with that, how the government was late, but it reacted to it. But mostly, again, as we've seen in this video as well, that it was the public, that it was people themselves, NGOs, filling in the gap, and that you had all these amazing initiatives happening, like coming out of nowhere, and doing amazing work. So it kind of, especially in retrospect, it kind of helped you see what the stories were.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, there's so much happening, and there's so much happened since then that I guess it can be a useful way to recall not only what you were seeing, but also maybe what you were feeling, because you were projecting a lot of yourself in these posts. So much has happened since January 2018, when you arrived to Delhi for the first time. How would you contextualize the pandemic in terms of all that has happened before it, and how do you see India and this region emerging from it?
Oh, that's a difficult question. Because I think still being kind of in the middle of it, it's very hard to detach it from, or to see it already from that bigger perspective. I think it has enforced a lot of the what is the word? A lot of the shifts. So from the moment that I arrived back in 2018, it was a year before the elections were going to start. This government had already been in power for a few years and was clearly very popular. And it was interesting to see that especially the political discourse in the way that this government was clearly showing its force, and especially after it won the elections back in 2019, how that is even more coming about now in this pandemic, in the way that this government is controlling now very much so, for instance, the narrative of what we see happening. That there is a lot of crackdown on journalists, on media now, and there's of course the whole backlash with social media that we see happening. So it's more that you can see the political narrative that was shaping up from 2018, 2019 onwards, how that is like being enlarged now in this pandemic, and how it will go forward from this. I'm really curious to see, especially from the international perspective. There was a lot of calls from, amongst others, of course, the human rights organizations about the decline in, or the crackdown actually on human rights that we've been seeing happening over the recent years, but not so much any response from the international community, from Western countries, calling up on India to but from the international community condemning India for what was happening, for instance, during the Delhi riots, where there was a lot of NGOs, Amnesty and human rights was calling out for that. In this pandemic, I think there has been a more clear, I would say, I think it's becoming more clear to the international community that things are, from a democratic point of view, that there's a lot of issues playing out in India which are worrying when it comes to freedom of press, when it comes to suppressing critical voices, and just the way that this pandemic has been handled, the promises, for instance, that have been made when it comes to the vaccination program, that the dent in India's reputation could be relatively big, and it will be interesting to see how that will how that will evolve from now.
Right.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I would just like to remind people that they're very welcome to send any questions they have for Ava on Facebook, on Twitter, and on the FCC South Asia website as well. We have a comment. I'm not sure if this is a question, but I'll put a comment to you, Ava, from Odysseus. And they say that, so unlike here, Nepalese don't think that corona is a Chinese virus.
I have not done the proper research to say that this is right or wrong. Well, actually, I have to say that was one person, but that's just one person who wanted to go into this with me, or was asking me if I believed that it was that the virus came from a lab or not. That was just kind of like to check with me because they had heard these reports. But again, like I don't know if that's if that's a very popular opinion or thinking.
But I think I mean, I'm not actually sure if they're referring to whether it came out of a lab or not, or rather talking about how in India, you know, there is a perception that it's referred to as the Chinese virus sometimes. I mean, I've heard it being referred to on a news channel as the Wuhan virus, for instance. Is there that kind of perception in Nepal that, you know, China is to blame for the virus?
I would not dare to say that if that's the case. That's not the feeling I got from being there, from speaking to people. But again, I wouldn't dare to say too much.
But it's an interesting point, actually, because, you know, Nepal is in sort of a quandary in the way that it's depending on India to supply it with vaccine. When those shipments stopped, it sort of had no choice in many ways but to go to China for vaccine, since COVAX, the facility that was created to help countries like Nepal receive vaccine, is really lagging in that area. Again, because it relied so much on an Indian-based company to supply it with vaccine, and that Indian-based company, namely the Serum Institute, has not been able, as India's needs have grown so much. That's all to say that, yeah, Nepal is in this interesting quandary. And I do wonder, the US President Joe Biden just yesterday had asked his intelligence to supply him within 90 days a report saying decidedly whether this virus emerged from the Wuhan lab. And that what was once considered a bit of a conspiracy theory is taking on sort of a life of its own after there's been some more reporting. And after a year of the pandemic, there's actually been no definitive proof that it did come from an animal transmission. So I do wonder what will happen. You know, India is sort of in the hot seat right now, as you point out. The criticism against it is growing. Just today, Twitter came out and said they were going to push back against new provisions that the Indian government has introduced on social media that would make it and other social media companies liable in some cases. But if China, as long as the spotlight remains on China and there are questions about whether it is withholding information about this virus, it's a difficult and sort of dangerous position to be in for small countries that are sandwiched in between these two countries.
Yeah, and I think also in the sense for Nepal, there is a different kind of what's the word? But the feeling towards China is very different in Nepal amongst the general public than it is in India. Very easily explainable because there's of course a lot more animosity, literally like border conflicts that are happening with India, and a government that has been very critical about the Chinese dominance that are doing. Like there's of course been a backlash on the Chinese companies, Chinese apps that have been banned. Like the Indian government has been very clear trying to take a stance against China, and that is not, of course, that's not the feeling that is in Nepal mostly. Like, people are at this point, for instance, seeing China coming in with vaccines, or India was supposed to give them vaccines and not giving them, pointing again to India as being the one that has been causing the second wave. So the feeling towards China is different, and is a lot less. There's a lot of animosity, I think, amongst the general public, also being fed to them as it is being fed here.
Interesting. Well, Ava, thank you so much for being with us tonight and telling us about Nepal and transporting us there through your reporting. And I don't personally read Dutch, but it's possible to read Ava's work in translation. Google Translate, I think, does a fair job of it. So I encourage you all to look up her name, look up her work. She's a prodigious reporter and an important part of our community here. And thank you again for being here.
And thank you for having me.
Manish.
Elizabeth, do you want to say something before I close?
Just that it was fantastic to hear from Ava again, because her experience is so unique, because there's so few foreign journalists who were in Nepal, and to hear exactly about the situation there, but also about how where you had to go and how you had to get there to do the story. It's not like us in the last week where we had to, and that has been dangerous as well, but we've just sort of, gone outside hospitals or outside crematoriums. I mean, you've had to trek the Himalayas to get to these stories. So it's so fantastic to hear about it. Thank you, Ava.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ava, and thank you, Elizabeth and Emily, particularly, for putting this together. Coffee with a Correspondent has become a very interesting part of what we do at FCC, particularly during these webinar times, as we don't have an opportunity to meet each other physically and do virtual meetings and discussions. And this has been a very interesting journey with you, Ava, to go to Nepal, because I don't know how many people would have dared to go to Nepal at this time. And you did. And then you had to cut it short, come back. So it was important for you to share your story with us. And it's very important to know what's happening in India and its neighborhood at this time, because 2 billion people in this neighborhood are all stuck in the same boat with the wrath of COVID-19 pandemic. These are mostly poor countries. They don't sometimes know what to do, and sometimes the government don't do the right things. And it's very difficult. But one important thing I'd like to mention before we close. Yesterday, I was listening to the president of Rwanda, the DG of WTO, the DG of WHO, and the managing director of IMF. And a very interesting statement was made by the Director General of WHO, saying that he was talking mostly in the African context, but I think we can sort of extrapolate it to a larger middle-income, low-income country scenario. And something that you alluded to also earlier, Emily, is that that US is thinking now, and he said, there is vaccine nationalism, there is vaccine apartheid right now in the world. And unless countries really look at their capacities, beef up their capacities, and sort of create an equitable distribution of this most desired, most needed quantity, or we don't need medicine, we don't need anything, we need vaccine. That's the only thing that can save humanity. So I hope through this we can appeal to the world, and most of us can write about it, that countries share their vaccines. India is right now in trouble, but I hope when India gets out of its own situation, it will help countries like Nepal. And thank you again for being with us, and thank you all that have joined us as our members in India and South Asia and around the world. We'll come back to you again very soon with another promising episode of Coffee with a Correspondent and our other webinars from FCC South Asia. Thank you, all three of you, wonderful ladies, and good night to all of you. Bye-bye.